Okay, so imagine a world where like all your opportunities, your worth, everything, even your basic rights are determined by something totally out of your control,
Like what?
the color of your skin.
Yeah, I see what you're going for there.
Yeah.
It's a chilling thought, right?
It is, and that's the messed up reality that racial supremacist philosophies have been trying to create for centuries.
And still are.
Exactly, and that's why we're diving deep into this topic today. It's a dark corner of human thought, but we got to shine a light on it. You know what I mean?
For sure. It's important to understand this stuff,
Yeah.
even though it's heavy.
Yeah, we're not going to sugarcoat it. But the goal isn't to bum everyone out. The goal is to understand how these ideas work so we can be better equipped to fight them.
Exactly. Knowledge is power, right?
Right. So before we go any further, let's get a working definition.
Yeah.
What exactly are we talking about when we say racial supremacy?
Well, it boils down to the belief that some races are just inherently superior to others.
Like better just because of their race?
Exactly. That they deserve to be in charge and have more power and privileges than others.
And that everyone else is just kind of stuck at the bottom simply because of who they are.
Right. And that kind of thinking ignores, all the things that actually make us who we are, our individual merits, our actions, our experiences.
Right. So it's not just about individual prejudice. It's about creating a whole system where certain groups are automatically on top and everyone else is beneath them.
Absolutely. Like baking inequality into the foundation of a society.
And these beliefs, they didn't just pop out of nowhere, did they?
Oh, definitely not. These weren't some random ideas pulled out of thin air. They were built on a foundation of bad science.
Like they deliberately twisted facts and cherry-picked data to support their agenda.
Exactly. It's like they already had the conclusion they wanted, and then they just went looking for anything that could kind of sort of back it up.
So basically mental gymnastics to justify their prejudice.
Basically. And the consequences of that kind of thinking have been devastating. I mean, we're talking genocide, colonization, systemic oppression, all justified by this idea of a racial hierarchy.
So to be clear, we're not just talking about some people holding outdated views.
Right. It's much bigger than that. This is about how those views become woven into laws and policies and institutions.
Impacting everything from education and healthcare to housing and the justice system.
Exactly. It's creating a system where one group has all the advantages and everyone else is playing with a stacked deck.
So to dismantle these systems, we need to understand how they work. What are the nuts and bolts of this ideology?
Well, one of the most dangerous and insidious tenets is biological determinism.
Okay, break that down for us. What does that even mean?
Basically, it's the idea that your race determines your intelligence, your morals, your abilities,
Yeah.
basically your entire potential as a human being.
So it's like saying that your genes dictate your destiny.
Right. And that completely ignores the fact that we're all individuals with unique experiences and opportunities.
It's like saying you're a better musician because you were born with longer fingers. It just doesn't make any sense.
Exactly. It's absurd. And yet, this idea was used to justify some truly horrific acts.
Like what?
Well, the Nazis and their obsession with the so-called Aryan race is probably the most well-known example.
Right. They were completely convinced they were the master race.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they used that belief to justify the systematic persecution and murder of millions of people.
It's a chilling reminder that these ideas aren't just some abstract theories. They have real-world consequences.
And to give their ideas a little more weight, they relied on these bogus scientific fields like phrenology.
Phrenology, that's the one where they study skull shapes, right?
Yeah. They thought they could determine your intelligence and character by measuring the bumps on your head.
Seriously.
Totally. And then there was eugenics.
Which was basically selective breeding to try and weed out the undesirable traits.
Right. They thought they could create a superior race by controlling who could reproduce.
It all sounds so incredibly backwards and dehumanizing looking back on it now.
It was. And those fields have long been debunked by actual science. But at the time, they gave a dangerous air of legitimacy to these racist ideas.
So they were using pseudoscience to justify their prejudice.
Exactly. They dressed up their hate in a lab coat and called it progress.
It's frightening how effective that kind of manipulation can be. But it's not just about biology, right? There's also this whole idea of cultural superiority.
Right. It's the belief that the dominant race's culture is just inherently better than all the others.
Okay, so let me guess. This means they dismiss the contributions and richness of other cultures completely.
Exactly. It's a way of saying, our way is the right way and everyone else is wrong.
It's like saying that one genre of music is objectively better than all the others, or that there's only one right way to live your life.
And that kind of thinking was a major driving force behind European colonialism.
Right. They saw themselves as bringing civilization to the rest of the world.
Exactly. And they used that as an excuse to conquer and exploit vast territories and populations.
It's like forcing someone to wear your clothes just because you think yours are better, even if they don't fit or suit their style at all.
That's a great analogy, because it's really about imposing your values and beliefs on others without any regard for their own culture or traditions.
It's a tragic reminder of how this idea of cultural superiority has been used to justify some of history's greatest injustices.
Yeah, and those injustices continue to have a ripple effect today.
So we've got biological determinism and cultural superiority. What's the third tenet that props up this messed up worldview?
The justification of social hierarchies.
Okay, so basically taking those abstract ideas of racial superiority and turning them into concrete systems of power and control.
Exactly. It's about saying we're on top because we deserve to be, and you're on the bottom because you're inherently less worthy.
So instead of seeing inequality as a problem to be solved, they see it as the natural order of things.
Exactly. And that kind of thinking leads to all sorts of messed up justifications for things like segregation, discrimination, and oppression.
So it's like they're building an entire society based on a lie.
A very dangerous and harmful lie. And to understand just how dangerous that lie can be, we need to look at how those blueprints for oppression were put into practice in the real world.
Okay, I think I'm ready for part 2. Let's do it.
All right, so to really grasp how dangerous these ideologies can be, we got to look at how they play out in the real world.
Okay, like specific examples of how these blueprints for oppression actually get built.
Exactly. And there's no better place to start than with Nazi Germany.
Yeah, that one still sends chills down my spine.
It's hard to even fathom how an entire nation could fall prey to such hateful ideology.
But they did, and it led to some of the darkest chapters in human history.
And it all started with this idea of Aryan supremacy.
Right, this belief that they were the master race destined to rule over everyone else.
Exactly. And they used that belief to justify the systematic persecution and murder of millions of people.
It's almost unfathomable how quickly a society can descend into such darkness.
Well, it starts with propaganda. Constantly bombarding people with messages about their own superiority and the inferiority of others.
So basically brainwashing an entire generation.
In a way, yeah. They twisted science and history to create this narrative that served their agenda.
And it wasn't just talk. They actually put these beliefs into action in terrifyingly systematic ways.
Right. They passed laws specifically designed to target and dehumanize entire groups of people.
Like the Nuremberg laws.
Exactly. Those were the laws that stripped Jewish people of their citizenship, their basic rights.
Made them second-class citizens in their own country.
Exactly. They banned interracial marriage, restricted their movement, and ultimately paved the way for the horrors of the Holocaust.
It's a stark reminder of what can happen when racial hatred is combined with political power.
And it's a reminder that we can never be complacent. We always have to be vigilant against these kinds of ideologies.
Because they can take root anywhere at any time.
Exactly. The seeds of hate are always there, lurking beneath the surface, just waiting for the right conditions to sprout.
So we need to be gardeners of a sort, pulling up those weeds before they have a chance to spread.
I like that analogy. But the Nazis weren't the only ones who built a system based on racial supremacy.
What about apartheid in South Africa?
Right, apartheid was another horrific example of how these ideas can play out in the real world.
And that was much more recent, wasn't it?
Yeah, apartheid was in effect in South Africa from 1948 to 1994.
So even as the world was moving towards equality and recognizing the horrors of racial injustice, South Africa was doubling down on segregation and discrimination.
Sadly, yes. And it was all based on the same twisted logic, that white South Africans were inherently superior to black South Africans.
And that justified denying black South Africans basic rights like voting, owning land, even living in certain areas.
Exactly, and it led to decades of oppression, violence, and suffering.
It's mind-boggling to think that this system was in place for almost 50 years. Did no one see how wrong it was?
Oh, there were many people both inside and outside of South Africa who fought tirelessly against apartheid. But the white minority government clung to power, determined to maintain its system of racial control.
It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit that people were able to resist such a brutal system and eventually bring about its downfall.
Absolutely. And it's a reminder that the fight for justice is often long and arduous, but it's a fight worth having.
And speaking of long and arduous fights, we can't talk about racial supremacy without talking about Jim Crow in the United States.
Right, that's another dark chapter in American history that we can't ignore.
It's a reminder that even in a country that prides itself on freedom and equality, the legacy of racial injustice runs deep.
Exactly. And even though slavery was officially abolished in 1865, its legacy lived on in the form of Jim Crow laws.
Which were basically a system of segregation and discrimination that permeated the American South for nearly a century.
Exactly. These laws were designed to keep Black Americans in a position of subservience, denying them equal rights and opportunities.
And they were incredibly specific about how they enforced that segregation, weren't they?
Oh, yeah. These laws mandated separate schools, public transportation, housing, even separate water fountains and restrooms.
It's almost absurd how far they took it, separating people based on race in every conceivable way.
But that was the point. It was about sending a clear message that Black people were inferior and that they didn't belong in the same spaces as white people.
And this wasn't ancient history either. These laws were in effect within living memory.
Exactly. It's a painful reminder that even in a country that prides itself on progress and equality, the legacy of racial injustice can be incredibly persistent.
And it's a reminder that the fight for racial justice is ongoing.
Absolutely. We still have a lot of work to do to create a truly just and equitable society.
So we've talked about Nazi Germany, apartheid in South Africa, and Jim Crow in the United States. But to really understand the global scale of this problem, we need to zoom out a bit.
What do you mean?
Well, all of these examples are horrific, but they're also somewhat isolated. They
Yeah.
happened in specific countries at specific times.
Okay, I see what you're getting at. We need to look at the bigger picture,
Exactly. We need to examine the broader historical phenomenon of colonialism.
because that's where we can really see how these ideas of racial supremacy were used to justify conquest and exploitation on a global scale.
So not just in one country, but across entire continents.
Exactly. And it wasn't just one group doing the oppressing. It was a whole system of global power structures built on the idea that European powers were superior to everyone else.
And that they had the right to rule over inferior races and take their land and resources.
Exactly. It was a classic case of the ends justify the means. They used a distorted sense of morality to excuse their greed and brutality.
And it led to centuries of suffering for countless people around the world.
It's a heartbreaking and infuriating chapter in human history. And sadly, it's not over yet.
What do you mean?
Even though colonialism, as we traditionally understand it, has ended, many of the systems and structures it created are still in place today.
So the legacy of colonialism is still shaping the world in profound ways.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's up to us to dismantle those systems and create a more just and equitable world.
Okay. So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the core tenets of racial supremacy, and we've seen how those ideas have manifested in some truly horrific ways throughout history. But what about today?
Right. Where do we go from here?
What forms does racial supremacy take in the 21st century? And how can we fight against it?
So we've talked about how racial supremacy is played out in these big historical events like Nazi Germany and apartheid.
Right. And it's easy to condemn those, obviously. But what about today?
Exactly, because it's not like racism just vanished overnight.
Right. So what does racial supremacy look like in the 21st century? It's probably not as in your face as like, swastikas and burning crosses anymore.
You're right. It's much more subtle and insidious. It's like a chameleon blending in with its surroundings.
So we got to learn to spot it even when it's hiding in plain sight.
Exactly. And one of the most common and dangerous ways it manifests today is through dehumanization.
Dehumanization. Okay,
Right.
would you unpack that a
Yeah,
little?
sure. It's basically the process of stripping away a person's individuality, reducing them to a stereotype or a problem to be solved.
So instead of seeing them as a complex human being with thoughts and feelings and experiences,
Right, you just see them as a representative of their race or group.
and that makes it easier to justify treating them badly.
Exactly, because you're no longer seeing them as a person worthy of respect and dignity.
It's like looking at a beautiful tapestry and only seeing one tiny thread, completely missing the intricate beauty of the whole picture.
Exactly. And that kind of narrow vision makes it easier to dismiss their concerns, their suffering, their very humanity.
We see this all the time, don't we? Like in the way certain groups are portrayed in the media.
All the time.
Yeah.
It's the stereotypes, the assumptions, the constant barrage of negative images and stories.
And it all contributes to this idea that certain groups are just less than human.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to be mindful of the narratives we consume and perpetuate.
So we need to be critical thinkers. Ask questions, challenge assumptions.
Exactly. And we need to make sure we're getting our information from a variety of sources,
Mm.
not just the ones that confirm our existing biases.
It's about expanding our understanding of the world and recognizing the humanity in everyone.
And that's a lifelong process.
Yeah.
It's not something you achieve overnight. It's about constantly learning, unlearning, and relearning.
So we all have a responsibility to educate ourselves and to challenge these harmful narratives whenever we encounter them.
Absolutely. Because silence is complicity.
Mm.
If we're not actively working to dismantle these systems of oppression, then we're passively allowing them to continue.
It's like seeing someone being bullied and doing nothing to stop it.
Exactly. We all have a role to play in creating a more just and equitable world.
Well, this has been a really eye-opening conversation. It's heavy stuff, but it's so important to talk about these things.
I agree. And even though we've gone to some dark places, I hope this deep dive has left you with a sense of hope and a renewed commitment to fighting for a better future.
Me too, because knowledge is power. And by understanding the insidious nature of racial supremacy, we can better equip ourselves to fight against it.
Exactly. It starts with awareness, then education, then action.
And it's a fight that belongs to all of us. It's not someone else's problem to solve, it's a collective responsibility.
Well said.
Oh.
And remember, change doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, effort, and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
But we can't afford to be complacent. The stakes are too high.
So keep learning, keep questioning, and keep fighting for a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been real. And remember, the fight for justice continues even when the podcast is over.